The last group of plants that we're going to talk about are the angiosperms. Angiosperms are what we call flowering plants. So these plants have vascular tissue just like the ferns and the gymnosperms. They have lignin just like the ferns and the gymnosperms. But the difference here, what they have evolved, are flowers. So instead of having a pollen cone like we saw in the gymnosperms, they produce pollen that is in a flower. So there are different parts of the flower, and I'll show you that in a moment. So one part produces the pollen, and the rest of the flower has nectar, and it has bright colors or bright petals. It might have a certain scent to it. So all these characteristics of a flower help to bring pollinators to the flower so that these pollinators can carry the pollen from one flower to another. And that allows cross-fertilization to happen, where they're helping to spread the sperm cells to other egg cells. So the purpose of the flower itself really is to assist with sexual reproduction. So it's helping the sperm cells to find egg cells of other flowers. So it's all about attracting that pollinator, right? So attracting it through the colors, the shapes of the flower, the scent, the nectar that it might provide. All of that is to attract pollinators. So the flower itself can have male and female components. Now, not all flowers have male and female components. There are some that are just male flowers and some that are just female flowers. So this difference depends upon the plant. So the female structures we'll start out with are the stigma. So you have the stigma at the top. All right, trying to highlight that right there with my little purple highlighter. So the stigma basically is the landing pad for the pollen. So the stigma a lot of times is sticky. So when a pollinator comes by and brushes against it, the pollen will stick to the stigma. Or in some cases, there might be wind pollination occurring. So we want to kind of, as you see, the stigma is elevated up, high up in the flower here. It's not at the base of the flower, but it's high up so that it could also catch the pollen that might be carried by wind. And then the stigma is connected to the ovary through the style, which is the long tube, and then down at the base is the ovary there. So the ovary inside of it has what are called ovules, and the ovules are where the egg cells are found. So when the pollen lands on the stigma, it grows a pollen tube down through the style, and the sperm cell migrates down into the ovary and enters into the ovule where the egg cell is found, and it fertilizes the egg cell inside. The male part of the flower is called the stamen, and we have the anther, which is this kind of oval shaped structure. You see kind of 6 of them in this image here. And once again, they're kind of elevated up off the base of the flower, and they're elevated by the filament, which is that stalk that is below the anther. So the anther is where the pollen is produced. So if there is a male component, we've got the anther making the pollen. It's elevated up off the base of the flower using a filament. Now, with angiosperms, once the egg cell is fertilized by the sperm cell, it starts to develop into an embryo, and that embryo, just like we saw in the gymnosperms, is basically becomes a a seed. It's packaged along with a food reserve in a seed, in the form of a seed. So the egg cell was in the ovules, and the ovules develop into the seed. The surrounding tissue of the ovary develops into a fruit. So we always think of fruits as having seeds inside of them. So whenever you have a fruit, it has always been produced from a flower. So the purpose of a fruit is basically to protect the seeds until they're ready to be dispersed. So a lot of times fruit may not ripen until a certain time period, and that's usually when the seeds have been fully developed, when there's enough of the packaged food reserve within the seed so that it can survive on its own. That's when the fruit then starts to ripen. And the fruit gets sweeter once it ripens. We also notice that the colors change when it ripens, and all of this is to attract some other organism to eat the fruit. So if they eat the fruit, then they wander off and go someplace else, and the fruit gets digested in their system. The seeds usually don't get digested, and then the organism kind of excretes the seed in their waste, and it's traveled some distance by that point in time. So it helps to disperse the seeds to a new area. And some seeds are actually have very thick, tough coats so that they actually cannot germinate unless they've been through the digestive system of some animals. And the acids in the digestive system help to break down the seed coat a little bit more so that it can germinate once it's excreted from the animal. Other fruits, though, they may simply rot afterwards, exposing the seeds. Now, the images on the right I've got of some different types of fruits that you may not be familiar with. So at the top there is a walnut. So you may not think of a nut as a fruit, but it is. So you have to think about anything that comes from a flower is a fruit. So anything that develops from a flower is a fruit. So a lot of times what we call vegetables are actually fruits. So when you think of peppers, we call them vegetables, but they're actually fruits. Now don't get confused though, because there actually are some vegetables that come from different parts of the plant. So if it comes from the root, or it comes from the stem, or if it comes from the leaf of a plant, then it's a vegetable. But if it comes from the flower, then botanically speaking, it is a fruit. So we've got the tomato there. We think of tomatoes as being vegetables, but they're technically a fruit. And then in the lower right-hand corner are the flowers of a grass. So you may not think of some plants as being angiosperms because they don't have big showy flowers that you normally recognize as a flower. So what you're seeing there, those purple little kind of oval structures that you see kind of poking out from that blade of grass, those are the flowers of the grass. So the grass that grows in your front lawn, that's actually an angiosperm. Okay, so a lot of the plants that are completely around us, surrounding you all the time, typically are angiosperms that you see. And you just may not realize that they are flowering plants because they just don't have showy flowers. So a lot of times they're very tiny or small. Okay, so think of a maple tree. A maple tree is an angiosperm. It produces flowers, and the seeds that you see that float down, some of you may have played with them as little helicopters. Those are actually fruits, right? So there's what we call fleshy fruits, which are the ones that are very soft and usually very sugary, versus dry fruits, which are the ones that aren't fleshy at all and are more like your nuts and your seeds, what we recognize as seeds, but some of them actually have a fruit around them. So it can be quite confusing at times to start to differentiate what's the seed and what's the fruit. Okay, but for the most part, a fruit comes from a flower, and inside the fruit is going to be the seed.